This episode of Bullet Heaven was made possible with a copy of the game provided by Bitmap Bureau.
Commencing operations. Your mission begins now.
It's time to go back to an age when twin-stick shooters were a lot different. The home console scene really saw these kinds of games, but titles like Robotron and, even more so, Smash TV, a game that did hit consoles, had been making the rounds in arcades for decades before the Xbox 360 revolutionized them. But this is not your parents' twin sticker. This is way newer.
Xeno Crisis is an arena-based twin-stick style shooting game developed and published by Bitmap Bureau in 2019. It has already seen release to many systems, including the Neo-Geo MVS, Neo-Geo AVS, as well as the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. It was also made available on all current major home consoles and Windows, Mac, and Linux PCs, with future releases on Neo-Geo CD and even the Evercade forthcoming. It's even on the Vita. Basically, if you have any kind of modern console or PC, you can play Xeno Crisis.
There's also one other system Xeno Crisis made it to as well, so for this review we're taking a look at the Sega Dreamcast version of the game, naturally. So what makes Xeno Crisis a game you should probably check out? Let's take a closer look. Starting out, players have their choice of two Marines when setting out in Xeno Crisis. John Marsh, who has slower speed but more ammunition, and Sarah Ridley, who's much lighter on her feet but carries less ammo at a time. Both offer a balance that more or less gives the player an equal advantage throughout the game, especially when upgrades are factored in. More on that in a bit.
While other control styles exist here, some of which are helpful for players using an arcade stick, by default, Xeno Crisis is set up in faux twin-stick style on the Sega Dreamcast controller. The player's selected Marine moves in 8 directions using either the D-pad or the analog stick. Pressing any face button will fire the player's weapon in its respective cardinal direction. The player can also press 2 buttons together to fire in a diagonal manner. This is a very similar setup to Smash TV on the Super NES. Ammo is limited but can always be restored when low or empty with a randomly placed ammo crate.
Players can also perform a melee attack automatically at very close range, but this should only really be used when no other means of attacking is available, as there's a degree of impreciseness and danger to it. Of course, if players need a little extra punch against larger groups of enemies or bosses, pressing the L trigger will lob a grenade in the player's current aim direction. These can sometimes bounce around with a little delay and sometimes explode on impact, so a little care will be needed to land them just right. A maximum number can be carried at once, but more can be found throughout the player's run if the player ends up using them to get out of a jam.
The player also has the ability to roll by pulling the right trigger, making them impervious to enemies or their bullets while in action. However, it's easy for the player to come out of a roll right into an enemy, if they aren't careful. If this can be anticipated, pulling the roll trigger again will cancel it immediately. If used correctly, the roll not only does a great job of allowing players to avoid heavier, more complex attacks from bosses and the like, but also makes collecting items in crowded areas much easier. Rolling can even serve to disarm certain enemies, and if players are extra skillful, they can even incorporate grenades into the maneuver.
All in all, the main controls here are pretty simple, but here's where things get a little more interesting. Xeno Crisis is set up in a roguelite manner, resulting in a stage layout that's different every time the game is fired up. This makes for a fresh gameplay experience every time the player takes Xeno Crisis on, but it also means that players will constantly need to adapt and anticipate where enemies will appear in a randomized environment, making for a high degree of challenge.
Thankfully, players will receive help throughout their whole mission. A number of special weapons and items will give players a fair shake at taking out their opposition in very effective, efficient manners. Special weapons will appear at random, each with varying styles and power. Lasers, shotguns, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, rebound shots, and more can be equipped to deal some heavy damage in a hurry, but will only last a specific amount of time before it's discarded, regardless of how much they are used. The player can also force discard these weapons if they are unsuitable for the situation they are in. All players need to do is press all 4 attack buttons at once.
Players start the game with limited health, indicated with a realistic-looking heart, which is displayed above the player character. Players will see this number when the stage starts, whenever the player is hit, or when life is recovered. This life total is also displayed on the VMU screen if one is inserted while playing. It's very easy for a player to get overwhelmed in Xeno Crisis, and if the player's life reaches 0, it's game over. However, med packs can also be found at random, much like special weapons. Two exist, small ones that recover just 1 life point, and larger ones that restore the whole stock to the player's current maximum, regardless of how little life remains. But 2-player games add another dynamic. They also allow for a fallen player to be revived by the surviving one.
The general uncertainty of these randomly placed items makes for a tense, challenging time. There was never really a moment where we felt completely in control of any given situation in Xeno Crisis, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially since some enemies will spawn right where the player's marine is standing. Players will really have to keep on their toes to stay ahead. Sure, the player is likely to find a good weapon and health at some point in the game, but when will it happen? And where on the screen? What will the opposition look like, and how crowded will it be? There's never any real way to tell, and that can be pretty exciting.
But players can also turn the odds in their favor with a bit more certainty as well. Throughout the game, enemies will often drop dog tags that players can collect. Like other items, they will disappear if left alone for too long. The dog tags can be exchanged for various upgrades and enhancements to make the going just a little easier for the player. Increased life, weapon power, ammunition, speed, grenades, and even credits can be bought between stages. Each character can only upgrade any one attribute to a predetermined maximum though, so the game will definitely still have the upper hand.
Though the game layout does change every time it's played, there is still a general overall structure to it. Xeno Crisis takes place over the course of 7 main stages. Players will take on each area room by room, Smash TV style, with some requiring players to find keycards or other items to make it to the end of the area. Large-scale bosses punctuate most of them, though Stage 3, for example, simply has players survive a veritable gauntlet of densely populated, enemy-infested rooms before making it to an airlock.
So is it any fun? Oh, definitely. But it's also not very newbie-friendly. Xeno Crisis is absolutely an intermediate to advanced level game. It's very fast-paced, yet will still definitely keep players on edge until the room in question is cleared. Players will also never want to be close to a door. Enemies will spawn at all entry points, walls, and floor holes of a given room, even through a door the player just went through. Hang around too long and the player will almost always be ambushed by a rogue baddie materializing from the floor underneath them. A lot of practice and understanding will be needed in order to see the real end of the game, and even on easy, Xeno Crisis is a game that doesn't fool around.
Players do, however, have the option to continue if they end up being killed. This will allow players to pick up right where they fell. Especially when it comes to learning the patterns and attacks of the bosses players will fight, these continues can be very helpful to make it just a bit further. However, the best endings will require that the game be beaten without continuing at all. As such, Xeno Crisis' staying power will be dependent on whether the player wants to see the game through on just 1 credit, and this is sure to be daunting to players with less skill, patience, or both.
The scoring in Xeno Crisis is pretty straightforward. Players will accumulate points for enemy kills, and that's more or less all there is to it. Clearing out as many rooms in a given stage as possible will be the key to scoring high. Players will also receive a score for any items that are picked up and any humans saved. It's simple, but it adds up over time.
At the end of each stage, players also get a letter grade based on how many hits they have taken and how long they took getting through. A maximum rating of S can be achieved. The player's current score is also displayed, alongside the high score for comparison.
As with a lot of roguelite games, Xeno Crisis' focus isn't really in its scoring system. There's a much greater emphasis on survival here, and it shows with its lack of local leaderboards. Only a single high score is all that will be maintained when saved to a VMU, and it will display during the game and after each stage. The player's score will also be maintained through continues.
Commander Darius, we have a code red distress signal from Outpost 88.
Xeno Crisis began life as a Mega Drive game, and that shows in its presentation. Whether it be the 16-bit visuals or the very distinct YM2612 sound, Xeno Crisis on the Dreamcast is a game that walks the walk and talks the talk. And a little bit more.
The visuals on the Dreamcast are generally indistinguishable from the Mega Drive version of the game. The same sprites, colors, and layout is employed with the option to play in 240 or 480p, depending on the output method chosen. Using a Pack-a-Punch RGB God cable from Retro Gaming Cables, a clean 1080p upscale is very easily obtained using a FrameMeister. Same goes for a 5x line double using the OSSC. Xeno Crisis is also VGA compatible.
One of the coolest aspects of Xeno Crisis is how not only the stages, but the enemies themselves change distinctly between each area. New foes are constantly introduced throughout the game, throwing both a greater challenge and fresh visual elements at the player constantly. There are obviously some enemies that are palette swapped aside from the new ones added to the fray, but the stages themselves are completely new in each area.
Xeno Crisis' sound is also one of its strongest attributes. On the Mega Drive, it's already excellent, but on the Dreamcast, it's even clearer. Everything from the player characters to the weapons to the enemies are ultra clear. There are even additional voice samples for the intro, human survivors, and various random events throughout the game that weren't in the Mega Drive version, and all with the added benefit of a much higher sound bitrate for playback.
Decent sound effects and voice clips are one thing, but the soundtrack in Xeno Crisis is another thing altogether. Composed by Savaged Regime, this is one of the best soundtracks on the Mega Drive to date. With flourishes of what sounds an awful lot like Sugumo's work from Thunder Force 4, the action on screen is perfectly accompanied and paced by these pieces. And like the sound effects, they're less chunky and much clearer on the Dreamcast than on the Mega Drive, even if they don't loop seamlessly.
Generally speaking, the interface during the main gameplay is simple but effective. Other versions using 16:9 aspect ratios add player stats, grenade stocks, and life totals at a glance, but these are notably absent here. Granted, this also falls in line with the kind of games that were produced in the 80s and 90s, so it's not such a big deal. Once again though, the player's life is still displayed on any VMU that might be in use at the time.
Additionally, the upgrade screen is clean and well designed, making for an easy, confusion-free character enhancement process. The only real thing we have a bit of a complaint with in terms of Xeno Crisis' presentation is the large overpixelated text for stage clear, letter grades, and room clears. Higher resolution lettering could easily have been used, but ugly though they may be, they're still functional in the end.
Another neat aspect of the game is how Kickstarter backers appear from time to time as humans in need of rescue. We actually came across a couple familiar names throughout our playthroughs, and it's always neat to see backers incorporated into the game like this. But a list of rescued humans after each stage, Metal Slug style, would have been neat.
Rounding out the presentation is a decent plot with a pretty big, gnarly twist that players are sure to experience on their first completion of the game. We won't ruin the surprise. So, how does Xeno Crisis on Sega Dreamcast stack up? Let's take a closer look.
Room clear.
Though the twin stick and classic control styles work well, the all-important rolls can be a bit of a sticking point.
Once the roll limitations are accustomed to, though, players should be able to shift into a daring offensive style rather than defensive.
Xeno Crisis is a hell of a hard game, so mastery of all of the player's techniques will be the top priority.
The roll is your best friend here, especially in crowded areas when ammo is across the room from the player.
With 6 stages that get progressively longer and harder as players go, getting through Xeno Crisis will take a while.
Practicing for a clean 1cc will definitely take a decent amount of time.
The visuals here are great, with clean, unique stage elements and new enemies introduced the whole way through.
Some of the text is overpixelated and chunky though.
One of the best soundtracks on the Mega Drive is made even better on the Dreamcast. Its tracks don't loop seamlessly though.
Meanwhile, the sound effects in Xeno Crisis are super clear, as are the voice samples. There's a lot more VO than in the Mega Drive version as well.
The Smash TV formula works well with Xeno Crisis, and with the addition of a roguelite randomized seed structure, players can take this game on forever.
The decent control setups, character upgradability, and sweet weapons are the cherries on top of a giant retrolicious sundae.
Xeno Crisis can be had for varying prices right on Bitmap Bureau's homepage, depending on the version and whether a physical copy is obtained.
In the case of the Dreamcast MIL CD version, it weighs in at 30 Great British pounds, giving it a pretty decent value.
We knew we just had to secure this one for the STG Chronicle at least, but getting hands-on showed us a brutal, unforgiving, challenging, and ultimately rewarding game. There's an absolute ton of replay value here, and we're sure to pop back in for quite some time in an effort to finally nab that 1cc. Xeno Crisis gets a 4.75 out of 5. You can get Xeno Crisis just all over the place, but if it's the Dreamcast version you need, check out bitmapbureau.com, linked below. Heavy Machine Gun.
Rocket Lawn Chair.
From a top-down twin-stick run-and-gunner to a side-scrolling one, we're diving into Metal Slug X on the original PlayStation in episode 279. Will it be better than Metal Slug 3?
Then it's on to the series finale with Hyperduel on Sega Saturn in episode 280 of Bullet Heaven.